Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Bertie Harrison-Braninsky, and today I'm talking to Sherri Goodman, a pivotal US figure when it comes to the intersection between issues relating to the military and security and climate and environment. Now a senior fellow at the Wilson Center and Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, Goodman is most well known for serving as the Pentagon's first Chief Environmental Officer from 1993 to 2001, and for landmark reports she later helped to deliver as the founder and executive director of the Center for Naval Analyses Military Advisory Board, which helped to establish climate change as a national security threat in the United States. We're talking today about her new book, Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. The book documents key challenges of her career, such as negotiations around the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 and escalating geopolitical tensions in the Arctic as a result of melting permafrost, which she describes as an accident waiting to happen.
In every phase of what's happening both in Ukraine and the Middle East, there's a very important cyber network dimension. So all of that has to be part of how we think about the energy transition as well.
I began by asking Sherri to introduce the book by explaining why the US military and defense sector have significant impact on global efforts to address climate and environmental crises.
The title of the book is Threat Multiplier. And why is it that the title? Because that's the phrase I coined in 2007 when I organized the first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change. And we spent a year with the world's leading climate scientists. We also traveled to the UK and met with the Met Office. We went to 10 Downing Street. We were at the Foreign and Defense Ministries. And we learned from the best of the British science and intelligence communities and in the US. And we determined with the warfighters we were working with that their eyes were opened, that they saw that a changing climate was going to change the basis of our global security. That really has three parts to it. So first, there's a geostrategic dimension in which, for example, an increasingly open Arctic means we have a region that is now more contested than cooperative, as it was through much of the previous period, even during the Cold War. And so now we have stronger storms all around the world. And that disruption makes it harder to plan for military activities and also increases the need for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in response to those storms. So everywhere from the Indo-Pacific to Latin America to here at home, our militaries are more frequently being called up to respond to both foreign and domestic natural disasters. Secondly, it affects our infrastructure. Military bases are like cities, whether they're on the coast or the inland, so broadly reflective of what's happening to our infrastructure nationwide, where they're subject to sea level rise and storm surge and coastal inundation, and either need to raise their piers or provide seawalls or use nature-based solutions in order to become resilient in the climate era. And thirdly, it's about how we use energy. There is a major effort to move to net zero and decarbonize in our militaries today to reduce the threat of the climate risks that we face. At the same time, we have found that we can align improved military effectiveness by many of these decarbonization strategies. One good example is a hybrid vehicle. Hybrid vehicles are quieter than a fully fossil fuel vehicle, and they have better torque. So there are some advantages in how they operate over traditional fossil fuels. And that also helps us reduce the long fuel supply lines that we faced in Iraq and Afghanistan when 8 out of 10 military convoys were trucking fuel to the front, putting soldiers and Marines' lives at risk from improvised explosive device attacks. And so if we don't need to truck so much fuel to the front, our soldiers can be safer and they can operate better in what we call today's contested logistics environment.
A lot of the books that we talk about on this podcast are quite difficult reads, offer quite scary visions of the future, but the tone of your book is actually probably more positive than people would expect, considering it's framed around threat. campaigners looking at the same kind of issues tend to focus on more negative messaging, such as the US military being the world's largest institutional consumer of petroleum. But at least in the modern day context, you position it as a leader on climate issues. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about why you went for that message of optimism and perhaps discuss some of the more positive case studies in the book that could be useful to people in the climate sector. I thought your discussion early on about closing military bases might be interesting to people working on issues around stranded assets, for example.
From threat multiplier to opportunity multiplier is how I wind up the book. And I do believe that we have the wherewithal to create a better future. We saw that in, let's take in a smaller example, the Montreal Protocol, when we were depleting the ozone hole, and that was going to be very dangerous for societies. And we came together in the 1980s under the Montreal Protocol. And what many of your listeners may not know is that the U.S. military was among the leaders in finding the substitutes for those ozone-depleting chemicals, because the U.S. military was a big user of ozone-depleting substances for firefighting. That's what they were very good for, firefighting, which obviously is essential in many contexts, particularly a military one. When the military got the word, and I tell this story in the book, the personal story of the EPA official who goes to an Air Force officer who turned out to be somebody I've worked with for many years. He was a young Air Force major at the time at Tyndall Air Force Base, and says, "Do you know that what you're doing is depleting the ozone layer?" And Tom Morehouse says, "No, I didn't know that." And so they started working on the chemical substitutes for that, and they found them. And to this day, Tom Morehouse is still a retired Air Force officer, still very involved in the Montreal Protocol and the continuing effort to improve those substitutes. We were able to phase those out and improve and repair the ozone hole. The climate challenge is obviously on a much grander scale, not as easy to tackle either diplomatically or technologically. It used to be the thinking, you had to have more oil or gas to go fast, like a tank. The Abrams tank was 2 gallons per mile. Need to have more oil, need to go faster, more fuel for your aircraft. But now that's not true. Now we're working on different designs for aircraft. We have a new blended body wing design for the future fighter jet that will be 30% more efficient, even on existing fuels. So that's one thing. Energy efficiency is an important fuel, often overlooked. But at the same time, we're looking at sustainable aviation fuels. We're looking at long duration storage. We're looking at small modular reactors. We're looking at deployable wind and solar and hydrogen fuels. So there are all sorts of ways, and we already have in the U.S. now several military bases that are net zero on energy. They're using microgrids, which is in many ways the wave of the future, so that you don't have to rely, perhaps fragile national grid. You can have a grid installed in your military base or your community or your industrial area, and then you put your own distributed energy resources on it. Might be, in some cases, at the first net zero military base in Albany, Georgia, in the U.S., they have a waste-to-energy plant. They're actually extracting the methane from an old landfill and using it as one of the energy sources. So there's a lot of innovation happening there. Job transition, either from closing bases or changing energy sources, or if you think about it, even migration, which is increasing in the climate era. In a broader historical sweep, if properly managed and properly led, can all be beneficial for society. I'll put in context that my parents are Holocaust refugees. So I grew up realizing that it was only because they were able to flee, because they were able to migrate, that I actually exist. Now, we don't want that to happen to most people under any kind of circumstances, and we should all be mindful of the treasure of democracy today and how fragile it is. At the same time, transitions can also provide opportunities. We've seen at many of the military bases in the U.S. that closed in the 1990s, particularly in major cities like in the San Francisco Bay Area or even in Charleston, South Carolina, that they are now greater engines of economic opportunity than they were when they were a military base. While that wasn't immediately obvious, But we work very hard. In the 90s, President Clinton was very committed to what he called job-centered property disposal and enabling those jobs to be, and fast-track cleanup. He told me I had to fast-track the cleanup. That wasn't the easiest thing in those days. We made it work because it was in the interest of the community. And I think, where there's a will, there's often a way to do that. So I see some of that happening today in the energy transitions that are underway now, and that part's exciting. And I also see that in the resilience and adaptation that communities are going to need to have to particularly coastal regions or fire-affected regions in many areas now and flood-ravaged regions. People have to rethink, should you really build back where you are, or can you relocate? And I know those are super hard decisions, but each successive storm should be a wake-up call to rethink hard about those decisions, because where people live and how they live is going to change in coming years, because so much climate change is already baked in that even if we are doing our best in the energy transition, and there are fits and starts there, even if we are really mitigating and reducing emissions, we still have a lot of temperature rise and sea level rise and storm surge baked into our system that's going to change many regions around the world in the coming decades.
Since 2015 and the Paris Agreement, there's been encouraged the countries report their military emissions and their decarbonisation plans, but they can still opt out of doing that. And NATO and the UK and the US are reporting those things, but many other countries aren't. And how much concern is there from the American intelligence and military world about that? Because I know that some of the early concerns, I think you talk about this in the book, were around this kind of idea of a disadvantage if America were limiting itself on climate targets and other countries weren't, or if America were being more transparent and other countries weren't. Do those concerns still exist? Is that still a discussion, or have things changed?
I think the discussion today is more about how you get competitive or comparative advantage on the battlefield by being able to diversify your fuel source and being agile, what we call agile and quick in a contested logistics environment. So if you're less dependent on a long fuel supply line and you have better batteries, you have lighter forces, and you're powered in a different way, then you can withstand and also have good cyber defenses, because in a more networked world, you're also more subject to cyber attacks. So those two things have to align together. And since every conflict now, and we've seen this now in every phase of what's happening both in Ukraine and the Middle East, there's a very important cyber network dimension. So all of that has to be part of how we think about the energy transition as well.
Thanks. And to follow on from you talking about Ukraine and the Middle East, and obviously we've had a lot of escalation in the Middle East in just the past few days, your 2007 report for the Center for Naval Analyses that coined the term threat multiplier, and that you position as kind of a key moment in accepting the risks to security from climate change, that made a lot of predictions about instability caused in the future by climate change. And I think by most accounts in the past 10 years, there has been an increase in instability around the world, including with conflict. And you were mentioning earlier about how in current conditions in the Arctic look like maybe science diplomacy is getting weaker despite all of the climate diplomacy going on. So do you think that the predictions that you were making, or the warnings that you were making in the noughties, have already come to pass? Do you see that trend as continuing?
I think geopolitical and geostrategic climate risks are accelerating today, unfortunately, because climate risk in general is accelerating. So with a more open Arctic, for example, because of sea ice retreat and rising temperatures and permafrost thaw and collapse, President Putin of Russia envisions a toll road for transportation across Russia's northern sea route from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. Meanwhile, China sees itself as a near Arctic stakeholder, wants to take advantage of those shorter shipping routes. Russia already allowed this summer a non-ice-clad vessel to transit that route. Now, there was no accident, but it's still very dangerous to operate even as the Arctic opens, because there's still a lot of ice in the region, and essentially it's an accident waiting to happen. And an oil spill in the Arctic in transboundary international waters is going to be much more difficult to contain and manage than, for example, the Deepwater Horizon spill or the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska, which was not even in Arctic waters. That's one set of risks that we have there. And now with Russia not part of the Arctic Council since an invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the science diplomacy with Russia has basically come to a stop. And the other Arctic nations, of course, collaborate, but we're lacking that direct information about changing conditions in Russia from that standpoint. Now, moving to Africa and the Middle East, what we see is that the prolonged drought in places like Somalia and previously in Syria led farmers and herders that had lived peaceably in the past to move to the cities because there wasn't enough water to support the traditional livelihoods. And that can lead to civil unrest or more immediately to a lack of employment for young male youth who then get recruited by terrorists. That is basically fuel for those terrorist organizations. We called climate change a petri dish for terrorism in parts of Africa and the Middle East and South Asia. And we still see that, unfortunately, happening today and continuing to worsen. And then, you have all in the Pacific and parts of the Caribbean, you have small island nations that are existentially threatened by climate change that in our lifetimes could see parts of their atolls, particularly the small island Pacific nations of Kiribati and Tuvalu, have already made plans to relocate parts of their population to other countries. These are countries where their exclusive economic zone, their maritime region, is actually bigger than their land region. This is called land and climate. So this is sea and climate, right? So what happens when you lose your land, but you still have potentially sovereign rights, to your fishing areas, which are part of you? How do you defend that? How do you ensure that the illegal fishing, which is just continues to grow around the world today, can be managed? So these are all sets of challenges that we face now in the climate era.
I think a lot of people in the climate sector increasingly are coming to terms with the fact that perhaps the only way to decarbonize to the extent that we will need to will involve some degrowth or demand reduction or energy efficiency, or whichever one of these phrases you use to kind of mean reducing the amount of stuff that we make and do, downscaling things a bit. And there are sections of your book where you talk about that tension with decarbonization. Do you think that some kind of downsizing or descaling or reduction in operations might be necessary to meet emissions targets for militaries? Or do you think that transitions to new technologies and new means of doing things will be enough?
I would reframe your question, Bertie, because unfortunately, I think global threats, including aggression by Russia in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East and China and the Indo-Pacific in Iran and North Korea, are not ones that we can ignore. So we've got to figure out, to protect our democracies around the world, we've got to figure out how to defend it from the authoritarian influences that are on the rise today and that are causing so much destruction. So I think the way to think about that is not about downsizing the military for the sake of climate. I think it's about ensuring we have the right military force to meet the needs of today, but doing so in a way that aligns with our climate objectives. We're certainly in a transition to a more autonomous world. Everything is more autonomous, and militaries are more autonomous today. Think drones. Drone warfare is the way of the future. So I think over time we will see fewer what we call manned systems. That is the way of the future.
But not necessarily energy use, I suppose. Is that the distinction?
Well, you don't make that transition for the sake of the energy use, but the way that unmanned and autonomous energy requires different energy use, and then you look at the best way to ensure that those systems have the right, more flexible energy use so they can bring the fight where necessary. We've talked a little bit about energy tech transitions, but I also want to say there's an exciting frontier in climate technology transitions as we improve our predictive capability to close the gap between reliable weather predictions and global climate models to give us more reliable sort of mid-range climate predictions that are going to be very useful in every sector of society, from agriculture to transportation and in the defense sector as well. And that's a combination of AI and quantum computing and improved modeling, downscaled climate modeling. And so for all the climate listeners here, that is an exciting field that's happening both in science and in the private sector and in technology. And we live in an era where technology now really spins into the defense sector. When I came of age in the 80s, a lot of technologies were spinning out from defense. We think of the internet and GPS that were really developed as defense research and development ideas and then spun out to the commercial private sector. Today, it's the other way around. Today, more investment is made in civilian R&D than in defense R&D. So technologies spin in. And think about the iPhone, the computer in your hand. That's all been something, and even autonomy today and AI, that's all happening in the civilian sector and then spinning into defense. The way that defense can actually contribute in this transition is by using its buying power in certain segments to sort of move that needle, particularly where you have, need some capital investment. But the exciting thing is for the technology developers in climate and clean energy to see that growth, be able to see that change, and then apply it where it can make a difference.
My thanks to Sherri Goodman for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovsky for our audio engineering. Threat Multiplier was published in August by Island Press, and you can find a link to buy it in the podcast blurb below. If you're a recent listener to our podcast and found this topic interesting, do scroll back, as you might enjoy past episodes covering topics such as military emissions, the security risk posed by nuclear power, or the difficulties in building climate-resilient infrastructure. Please do leave us a review and follow us on your preferred podcast platform, and remember to check out all of our other content on our site at www.landclimate.org. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time, so until then, goodbye, and thank you for listening.